India's sneaky move: how India stole the U.S. smartphone market from China in 2025. In a groundbreaking development, India has officially surpassed China as the top supplier of smartphones to the United States for the first time, a significant milestone that occurred in the second quarter of 2025. This shift is largely attributed to Apple's strategic decision to ramp up iPhone production within India, amidst ongoing uncertainties surrounding tariffs imposed by the U.S. government under President Donald Trump. According to a recent report from Canalys, which is now part of Omdia, this change marks a pivotal moment in the global electronics manufacturing landscape, driven by Apple's efforts to diversify its supply chain and enhance iPhone assembly operations in India. The Canalys report highlights that the backdrop of uncertain negotiations with China has prompted many companies to rethink their supply chains. It notes that U.S. smartphone shipments experienced a modest growth of 1% in the second quarter, as manufacturers sought to stockpile device inventories in anticipation of potential tariff impacts. Interestingly, despite a notable 38% year-on-year increase in Samsung shipments to the U.S., primarily due to its popular Galaxy A series, the overall smartphone shipments to the U.S. only rose by 1% during this period. A striking statistic from the report reveals that the proportion of U.S. smartphone shipments assembled in China plummeted to 25% in the April to June timeframe, down from a substantial 61% just a year prior. This decline has been significantly offset by India, where the volume of smartphones labeled as Made in India surged by an impressive 240% year-on-year. As a result, these smartphones now represent 44% of all smartphones imported into the U.S., a remarkable increase from just 13% in the same quarter of 2024. Sanyam Chaurasia, a principal analyst at Canalys, commented on this historic achievement, noting that India has emerged as the leading manufacturing hub for smartphones destined for the U.S. market, for the very first time in Q2 2025. This shift has been primarily driven by Apple's accelerated transition of its supply chain to India, particularly in light of the uncertain trade dynamics between the U.S. and China. Chaurasia elaborated that Apple has significantly increased its production capabilities in India over recent years as part of its China Plus One strategy. This approach has led Apple to allocate a majority of its export capacity in India to meet the demands of the U.S. market throughout 2025. Notably, Apple has commenced the manufacturing and assembly of the Pro models of the iPhone 16 series in India, although it still relies on its established manufacturing facilities in China to meet the larger supply requirements for these Pro models in the U.S. In addition to Apple, other companies like Samsung and Motorola have also begun to increase their supply of smartphones targeted at the U.S. market from India. However, Chaurasia pointed out that their transitions are occurring at a much slower pace and on a smaller scale compared to Apple's rapid expansion. He noted that while Motorola shares a similar manufacturing base in China as Apple, Samsung predominantly produces its smartphones in Vietnam. Runar Bjorhovde, another senior analyst at Canalys, added that vendors are continuing to stockpile devices and maintain elevated inventory levels to mitigate the risks associated with potential tariffs that may be implemented later in the year. However, the market's growth of only 1% suggests a lackluster demand in an increasingly challenging economic environment, highlighting a growing disparity between the number of devices sold into the market and those actually purchased by consumers. This situation raises important questions. How will these shifts in smartphone manufacturing impact global trade dynamics? And what does this mean for consumers in terms of pricing and availability? We invite you to share your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. India surpasses China as top smartphone exporter to the U.S. Who would have predicted that India would unseat China as America's leading smartphone supplier? Yes, it's really happened, and the global smartphone supply chain has been turned on its head. For the very first time, India has surpassed China to claim the title of the top smartphone exporter to the United States. The main force behind this shift, Apple's dramatic move to relocate much of its manufacturing away from China, driven by tariffs and global trade tensions, with India quickly stepping up to fill the gap. But here's where it gets even more interesting. According to a recent Canalys report, India's share of smartphones imported by the U.S. soared to 44% in the second quarter, an enormous leap from just 13% in the same period last year. To put that in perspective, the number of smartphones manufactured in India and destined for the U.S. ballooned by a staggering 240% year-over-year. Meanwhile, China's share of U.S. smartphone imports plummeted to only 25%. That's a dramatic dive from the 61% they held 1 year prior. In fact, China now trails behind Vietnam in the rankings. Quite a stunning reversal for a nation long regarded as the world's electronics powerhouse. But what's fueling India's rapid rise? Experts point squarely at Apple. The U.S. tech giant has been rapidly ramping up its production capabilities in India, especially as friction escalates between Washington and Beijing. Successive trade disputes, ever-shifting tariffs, and mounting unpredictability have made China an increasingly risky bet for manufacturers. Sanyam Chaurasia, principal analyst at Canalys, explained that Apple's strategy this year was to dedicate the majority of its Indian manufacturing output to satisfy demand in the U.S. market. Still, Chaurasia cautioned, Apple remains tied to its well-established production networks in China, at least for now. And this is the part most people miss. The U.S. has imposed tough tariffs on a range of imports, yet electronics containing semiconductors, including most smartphones, dodge the harshest of these. Yes, China-made iPhones are somewhat shielded, but Apple's Tim Cook revealed that even these devices currently face a baseline 20% tariff. Cook expects that the majority of iPhones sold in the U.S. will soon be made in India. Here's a controversial twist. Former President Trump's steep tariffs on Chinese goods, up to 145% in some cases, aim to ignite a renaissance in American manufacturing. However, instead of bringing production home, these tariffs appear to have redirected much of it to other countries like India and Vietnam. China has struck back with its own tariffs, and although a short-term truce has been negotiated, the instability has shaken up global supply chains. Talks in Sweden this week could determine whether this delicate peace holds. Yet the repeated volatility has already convinced companies to look for safer, more stable production hubs. This isn't just a new development. It continues a trend that's been gathering steam over the past several years. As tensions with Beijing escalate, Western companies are increasingly diversifying where and how they produce high-tech goods. Vietnam and India, in particular, have become go-to options for those hoping to avoid the pitfalls of over-reliance on a single country. Remember the chaos during the pandemic, when China's zero-COVID policy threw supply chains into turmoil worldwide. That was a wake-up call for many in the industry. So, looking ahead, how will these shifting production lines impact global competition, the cost of your next smartphone, or even relations between the world's largest economies? Are these changes a win for India? A loss for China? Or should America do more to build factories on its own soil? This debate is only getting started. Where do you stand? Share your thoughts below and join the conversation. India overtakes China. The rise of smartphone manufacturing. India is rewriting the global tech map in a way few could have predicted just a few years ago. Imagine this, the country that once relied heavily on imports for its tech needs is now the top manufacturer of smartphones destined for American consumers. And the driving force, Apple Inc., has quietly but decisively shifted its production strategy, making India the epicenter of its iPhone assembly operations. But here's where it gets controversial. This shift isn't just about cost savings. It's a geopolitical chess move with far-reaching implications for global supply chains and labor markets. Let's break it down. According to Canalys data, in the quarter ending June 2023, India accounted for a staggering 44% of all smartphones shipped to the U.S., dethroning China, which had dominated the market for years. Vietnam, home to much of Samsung Electronics Co. www.bloomberg.com/005930 production came in second. Meanwhile, China's share plummeted from over 60% a year ago to just 25%. This seismic shift isn't just a numbers game. Apple's decision to scale up manufacturing in India reflects a broader trend. Companies are diversifying away from China to mitigate risks like trade tensions, rising labor costs, and supply chain vulnerabilities. But what does this mean for workers in India? While the influx of tech manufacturing could boost local economies, critics argue it might also lead to exploitative labor practices if not carefully regulated. And this is the part most people miss. The environmental impact of shifting production to a country with less stringent emission standards could offset some of the benefits. Should we celebrate this shift as a win for India's economic growth? Or is it a cautionary tale about the hidden costs of global manufacturing? The debate is far from settled. What's your take? Do you think this move is a smart, long-term strategy for Apple? Or are we overlooking critical challenges? Share your thoughts in the comments below.